We don't pay him to think." The vice president said it in a room full of engineers, and Walter Odom heard every word through the wall he was mopping. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He just kept moving the mop in slow gray circles, the man they called Simple, holding the answer to a $4 million problem in a notebook in his garage for 19 years. Every plant has a man nobody looks at twice. At Halloran Precision Works, that man carried a ring of 40 keys and a mop, and his name was Walter. He came in on the 2 o'clock shift, when the day people had punched out, and the floor belonged to the machines and the mice and the low orange hum of the sodium lights. That was the part of the job most men couldn't stand. The emptiness of a factory at night, the way sound traveled too far, the way a dropped wrench 3 aisles over could make you jump. Walter loved it. In the daytime, the plant was a place that talked over him. At night, it was a place that finally sat still and let him look. And he looked at everything. He'd start at the front office, empty the wastebaskets, run the mop down the tile hall past the framed photographs of Halloran men, shaking hands with men in better suits. Then out through the double doors onto the machining floor, where the real plant lived. The Bridgeports and the lathes and the surface grinders lined up like sleeping animals, each one still faintly warm from the day's work, each one smelling of cutting oil and hot steel. He knew every machine on that floor by its sound. He'd never run a single one on the clock. Nobody had ever asked him to. But he knew them the way a farmer knows his fields. That's why on this particular Tuesday in March, he stopped at the number 4 Bridgeport mill without deciding to. Somebody on the day shift had left the depth stop set wrong, not by much. A few thousandths of an inch, a couple of thou, the machinists called it, a measurement smaller than a sheet of paper. The kind of error that doesn't look like anything until the first part comes off the line scrap, and a whole run behind it goes in the bin. Walter set the mop against the machine. He leaned in, tilted his head to read the little chrome dial in the half-light, and turned it back. A hair, 2 hairs, until the number sat where it was supposed to sit. Then he wiped a smear of oil off the handle with his thumb, picked up his mop, and moved on. He didn't tell anyone. He never told anyone. Come morning, some day shift machinist would step up to that mill, run his first part, measure it, and find it dead perfect, and never once wonder why. Men like that assumed the world simply worked. Walter had learned, a long time ago, that the world worked because somebody quiet had gotten there first. They didn't call him Walter. Most of them, they called him Simple Walt. Not out of hate. That was the thing about it. Nobody at Halloran hated Walter Odom. Hate would have meant they'd noticed him. It was gentler than that, and worse. He was the man you handed your coffee cup to without looking, the way you'd set it on a table. He was the gray shape at the edge of the room. When the young engineers passed him in the hall, mid-sentence, they didn't lower their voices, because it never occurred to them there was anyone there to hear. One of them, a kid, maybe 24, fresh out of Ohio State with the ink still wet, had started the name. Walter had been kneeling by a vending machine, fishing out a jammed quarter for him, and the kid had laughed and said, "Thanks, Simple Walt," and clapped him on the shoulder the way you'd pat a dog that did a trick. The others picked it up. Within a month it was just his name. Simple Walt, the man who couldn't do the job the smart men did. Walter never corrected them, not once. He had a rule about that, and the rule was older than the plant. When a man decides what you are, you don't argue with him. Arguing only tells him you care what he thinks. And Walter had stopped caring what most men thought around the same time he'd learned to read a micrometer, which was to say, a very long time ago, alone in a garage, off the back of an army manual and a lathe he'd bought for $40. So he wore the name the way he wore the gray work shirt with Walt stitched over the pocket. It was a uniform. It let him move through the whole plant, every department, every bench, invisible as air, and Walter Odom had figured out something the engineers never would. Invisible men see everything. His shift ended at 10. He punched the time clock, the same worn card, the same soft chunk of the machine stamping the hour, and walked out across the gravel lot under the sodium lights, past the water tower where the town's name was fading letter by letter, and got into a truck that had 190,000 miles on it and no radio he ever turned on. He drove home the long way. He always did. The long way took him down the river road, past the shops that used to run 3 shifts and now ran none, the machine shops, the dye works, the little tool and D outfits that had built this town and were dying in it. Dark windows, for lease signs curling in the damp. Dayton had lost half its shops in a decade, and Walter had watched every one of them go dark from the seat of this truck. The way you watch the lights go out in a house across the valley and know somebody's story just ended. He didn't slow down. He'd learned not to. Then he turned into a gravel drive, past a house with one lamp burning in the front window that he'd forgotten to turn off, and pulled up in front of a cinderblock garage. Inside, he switched on a single bare bulb. He hung his keys on a nail. And then Walter Odom did the thing that no one at Halloran Precision Works had ever seen him do, the thing that would have stopped every one of them cold, the vice president most of all. He crossed to the workbench, took hold of a heavy canvas tarp, and pulled it off in one smooth motion. Underneath was a lathe, old, immaculate, oiled to a shine, every tool in its place around it. And above the bench, on a shelf that ran the length of the wall, sat 19 bound notebooks, one for every year, filled edge to edge in a careful block hand with the answers to problems Halloran didn't even know it had yet. The plant thought Walter Odom couldn't do the job. The engineers did. They had it exactly backwards. He'd already done it. They just hadn't found out yet. There were 19 of them, and they were stacked on a shelf in the garage in the order he'd filled them. 1984 on the far left, its cover soft as cloth from being opened 10,000 times, and the newest one on the right, its spine still stiff, still learning. Walter ran a finger along them the way another man might run a finger along the spines of a Bible he'd read cover to cover. He didn't take one down right away, he just looked. It was a thing he did most nights before the work. A kind of counting, a way of making sure the years were all still there. They were composition notebooks, the black and white marbled kind you could buy for $1 at the drugstore on Wayne Avenue. Nothing special. That was the point. A poor man's laboratory kept in a poor man's hand. But open one, and the ordinary stopped. Every page was numbered, top right corner, small in the same block print. Every entry was dated, month, day, year, the first line of every single day he'd worked at that bench. And at the bottom of the important pages, beneath a sketch or a speck or a column of figures, there was a second thing, a second name, and a date beside it. Read and understood. E. Kowalczyk, that was Earl. Earl Kowalczyk was a welder on the night shift, back when Halloran still ran a night shift. A big Polish man with forearms like fence posts and a laugh you could hear across the floor over the grinders. Earl was the first man at that plant who'd ever looked at Walter twice, and the only one who'd figured out what he was looking at. It happened by accident, the way the important things do. Walter had been fixing a broken fixture on a jig borer off the clock on his own time, because it bothered him to see a good machine run wrong. He'd sketched out a better way to hold the part, a little clamp with a floating pad so the metal couldn't rock, on a scrap of cardboard. Earl had come by with his coffee and looked over Walter's shoulder and gone quiet, which was not a thing Earl Kowalczyk did. "You draw that yourself?" Earl had said. Walter, embarrassed, had gone to crumple it up, and Earl had put one big hand flat on it. "Don't you do that?" Earl held his eye. "That's a real idea, Walt. That's a good idea. You know what the engineers do with a good idea? They write it in a book, and they get a fella to sign it and put the date, so nobody can ever come along later and say it was theirs." Earl had tapped the cardboard. "You start writing 'em down. You bring 'em to me. I'll read 'em and I'll sign 'em and I'll put the date. That's how it's done. That's how the smart guys do it. And you're the smartest guy in this whole damn building, and you're the only one don't know it." Walter never forgot that. The only one don't know it. The next week he bought the first notebook, and every good idea that ever came to him after that. Every fix, every better way, everything he saw at the plant that was wrong and quietly imagined right, went onto a numbered, dated page. And when he had enough of them, he'd carry the notebook to the welding bay at 2 in the morning, and Earl would set down his hood and read it, slow, moving his lips a little, and then he'd sign his name and write the date and hand it back. Read and understood. E. Kowalczyk. Walter never once thought of those signatures as evidence. He thought of them as friendship. He didn't know, couldn't have known, that Earl, without meaning to, had handed him the single most powerful thing an inventor can own: a witness, a date somebody else swore to. But there was a reason Walter kept the notebooks in the garage and not at the plant. A reason he never spoke up, never raised his hand in a meeting, never once carried one of his ideas up the front office hall to the men who might have used it. The reason had a name, too, though Walter had long since forgotten the man's face. It had happened early, the second or third year. Walter had come up with a fixture, a real one, that would have cut the setup time on a whole family of parts by half. He'd been proud of it. Proud enough to break his own rule. He'd copied the drawing out clean onto a fresh sheet, and he'd carried it, hands sweating, up to a foreman named Briggs, and he'd said, quiet, "I think this might help." Briggs had looked at it the way you look at a child's drawing. Said, "Huh, leave it with me." And Walter had left it. 3 weeks later, that exact fixture went into production. There was a little brass plate on it with a part number and a name. The name belonged to a young engineer named Prentice, who had never, as far as Walter knew, set foot on the floor after dark. Nobody said thank you. Nobody said anything at all. It was as if the idea had simply appeared, fully formed, from the department that was paid to have ideas. And Walter had stood there at his mop, watching his own work bolted to a machine with another man's name on it, and he'd learned the lesson that would shape the next 17 years of his life. Keep it in the notebook, not out of spite. Out of something quieter and harder than spite. The world, he'd decided, was not going to give him credit for what he was, so he stopped asking it to. He'd keep the record for himself, in his own hand, dated and witnessed, and if the day never came when it mattered, well, a man could still know his own worth in a room where no one else did. That was enough. That had to be enough. He didn't know it wasn't the end of the story. He thought it was. Somewhere in the middle of the stack, the notebook marked 1991, there was a page. Walter didn't turn to it that night. He didn't need to. He could have found it in the dark, page 104. A coupling, the kind of heavy hydraulic coupling that mated 2 lines of high-pressure fluid, the kind that ran hot and cold and hot again 1,000 times a day until the metal itself got tired. He'd seen one crack, years back, on a machine out on the floor. Seen where it cracked, always at the same place. The shoulder where the fat part stepped down to the thin part, a hard square corner. And something in Walter, the thing that couldn't leave a wrong machine alone, had gone home and thought about it. Not for money. There was no money in it. He just wanted to know why. So on page 104, in 1991, he'd drawn it. The coupling, in cross-section, clean as an engineer's. And at the shoulder where the others cracked, he'd drawn something different. Not a hard square corner, but a smooth, generous curve, a relief radius. He'd written beside it, in his block hand, the reason that the sharp corner concentrated the stress into a single line, the way you snap a bar of chocolate along a scored edge, and that a curve would spread that stress out and let the metal breathe. He'd noted the size of the radius. He'd noted a heat treat, how hard to draw the steel back so it wasn't brittle. He'd noted the feeds and speeds to cut it. And at the bottom, in another man's hand, read and understood, E. Kowalczyk, 6391, June 3, 1991. It was, to Walter, just one page among thousands. A puzzle he'd solved for no one but himself, a long time ago, and closed the book on. He had no idea, none, that 11 years and a defense contract later, $4 million and a room full of the brightest men Halloran could hire would batter themselves bloody against the exact problem he'd already answered on page 104. That they would draw the same coupling on their whiteboards and never think to round the corner, that the whole thing already existed, finished, witnessed, and dated, gathering dust on a shelf in a cinderblock garage. He didn't know any of that. He just closed the notebook most nights and got to work on the next thing. The garage got cold after 10. Walter kept a space heater going by his feet and a thermos of black coffee on the corner of the bench, and the single bulb overhead threw his shadow big against the block wall while he worked. It was quiet in a way the plant was never quiet. The plant at night was full of the ghosts of the day, the residual warmth in the machines, the smell of other men's work. The garage was only his lathe, his tools, each in their painted outline on the pegboard, his notebooks, his coffee going cold. His wife would have brought him a fresh cup around now. Ruth had done that for 31 years. Come out to the garage a little before 11 with a mug in each hand, no words, and sat on the stool in the corner and watched him work until he was ready to come in. She'd been gone 3 years this spring. Cancer, quick, the way it sometimes is with the kind ones, as if the world can't stand to draw it out for them. He'd kept the stool where it was. He still made the coffee in the 2-cup pot out of habit and drank both. He wasn't a bitter man. People assumed he must be a man that smart, treated that small for that long. But bitterness was a kind of noise, and Walter had spent his whole life turning noise down. He had his lathe, he had his notebooks. He had the memory of one man who'd known what he was, and one woman who'd sat on that stool and never once thought he was simple. That was a life. It was more than most men got. He never once thought of those notebooks as a weapon. He thought of them the way other men thought of prayer, a quiet place to put the thing you couldn't say out loud. That would change the day the company reached, by accident, for the exact page he'd written in 1991. That's not how we do things here anymore, gentlemen. That's how we used to do things. And look where that got us. Gregory Vance said it to a room full of men who'd built parts with their hands for 30 years, and he said it smiling. And that was the first thing anyone learned about Gregory Vance. He could take the worst thing you'd ever heard about yourself and wrap it in a smile so smooth you'd shake his hand for it. He arrived at Halloran the year the last of the old shops on the River Road went dark. He came with a Wharton diploma in a frame, a silk tie he wore out onto the factory floor, where every other man wore denim, and a budget the old-timers used to make an entire product line. Vice President of Engineering, 44 years old. He walked the floor once a week with his hands clasped behind his back, like a general inspecting a line, and he never touched a single machine, because touching machines was not, in his view, what he was paid for. What he was paid for was the future. And the future, Gregory Vance had decided, was going to save Halloran Precision Works. Or, if it didn't, it wasn't going to be his fault. The future had a name that year, and the name was a contract. A defense contract. The biggest thing to come through Halloran's doors in 15 years, a run of high-pressure hydraulic couplings for a system that Walter, mopping, only ever heard about in fragments through office walls. Couplings that had to hold under heat and cold and heat again. Cycle after cycle, 10,000 cycles without so much as a hairline. Get them right, and Halloran had 3 years of work and a plant full of men who kept their houses. Get them wrong. And the contract went to a shop in another state, and the water tower kept fading letter by letter. Vance staked everything on it, and he staked it on his golden boys. That's what the floor called them, half joking, half not. The R&D team Vance had built in a glass-walled lab at the back of the plant, 6 young engineers with good schools behind them and whiteboards in front of them, the youngest of them making more in a year than a machinist. Made in 2. They had computers. They had a budget line that by the time it was done would read $4 million. They had Gregory Vance's whole future riding on their shoulders, and they knew it, and they wore it like men who'd never once been wrong about anything. There was one of them who didn't quite fit. A young woman named Dana Reyes, 3 years out of Purdue, who had a habit, unpopular in that lab, of walking out onto the floor and asking the old machinists how a thing actually behaved when you cut it. She'd get grease on her sleeves. She'd listen. The others thought it was quaint. Vance thought it was a phase she'd grow out of. Remember Dana? She's the only one in that lab who ever really looked at Walter Odom, and she's going to matter later more than any of them. But that came later. First came the night the whole thing turned. It was past 9. The day shift was long gone. Walter was working his way through the R&D lab with his bin and his cart, emptying waste baskets. The one department he moved through fastest, because the Golden Boys threw away enough paper for a small forest and never looked up while he did it. That night they were still there, all 6 of them, and Vance, standing around a bench under the hard white light, arguing about a prototype, the coupling. Machined, gleaming, held up in someone's blue-gloved hand, and even from across the lab, even without his glasses on, Walter's eye went to it the way a tongue goes to a sore tooth. He saw the shoulder, the place where the fat part stepped down to the thin part, and he saw that they'd cut it as a hard square corner. He knew what a hard square corner did. He'd known it for 11 years. He should have kept moving. He'd kept moving for 19 years. But there's a thing in a man who understands machines, a thing that lives below decision, and it saw 100 good men's jobs bolted to that little steel corner about to crack, and it opened Walter's mouth before Walter could stop it. That radius. His voice was quiet, rough from not being used much. The room turned. He nodded at the coupling. That corner there, where she steps down, that's going to crack. Right there. Won't matter how hard you make it. The corner's carrying all the load in one line. He paused, and then, because it was true, he added the rest plain. You want to round it? Put a curve in it? Spread it out? For 1 second, the lab was dead silent. One of the Golden Boys actually glanced down at the part. Then Gregory Vance laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. That was the awful part. It was easy, warm, the laugh of a man genuinely delighted by something charming. He looked at Walter the way you'd look at a parrot that said a whole sentence. Walt, he shook his head, still smiling. We don't pay you to think. That's what $4 million is for. He gestured, gentle, generous, at his team. These men went to school for this. 10 years, some of them. You went to school for a mop. A couple of the Golden Boys chuckled. Not all of them. Dana Reyes did not. Her jaw set hard, her eyes down. Vance didn't notice. Vance was already turning back to the bench. Bin's full over there by the plotter, if you don't mind. There's a good man. And that was it. The conversation was over. Walter had, for the space of 10 seconds, ceased to exist in that room the moment before he spoke, and now he'd ceased to exist again, and the Golden Boys went back to their whiteboards. Walter emptied the bin by the plotter. He tied off the bag. He loaded his cart, and he walked out of the R&D lab without a word, past the framed diploma in Vance's office, out through the double doors onto the dark machining floor where the real machines slept. And he did not let his face change once, because a man's face was the one thing he could keep. Here's the thing you need to understand, and it's the thing Gregory Vance never would. Walter was not humiliated. Humiliation is what you feel when a man says something about you that you're afraid might be true, and there was nothing Vance could say that Walter feared. He knew what he was. He'd known since he was a young man alone with a $40 lathe. He'd built a life on knowing it privately, and Vance's laughter didn't touch that any more than a stone thrown at a lake touches the bottom. What Walter felt, driving the river road home that night, was something closer to sorrow. Because he'd told them the truth, the actual load-bearing truth, and he'd watched it fall on the floor of that lab and get swept up with the rest of the trash. And he knew, with the flat certainty of a man who understands metal, exactly what was going to happen next. Those couplings were going to come off the line looking perfect, and they were going to crack at the shoulder, right where he'd said, and a plant full of men whose kids he'd watched grow up in the parking lot, men who'd handed him their coffee cups without ever learning his name, were going to lose everything for want of a curve that Walter Odom had drawn in a dollar notebook in June of 1991. He pulled into the gravel drive. He turned on the bulb in the garage. He didn't uncover the lathe. He went instead to the shelf and took down the notebook marked 1991, and he opened it to page 104, and he laid it flat on the bench under the light, and he looked at it for a long time. The coupling, the rounded shoulder. Earl's signature, June 3rd. He wasn't gloating. There was no one to gloat to. And even alone, in an empty garage, Walter Odom was not a man who gloated. He was doing something else, something quieter and stranger. He was checking, comparing the part he'd seen in that gloved hand against the drawing on the page, the way you'd hold a photograph up next to a face. Making sure, making sure that after all these years, after everything, he had still been right. He had. Walter closed the notebook and turned off the light. He wasn't angry. Anger was for men who thought the world owed them an apology. He'd stopped expecting one a long time ago. He just kept the page, the way you keep a receipt. It's the steel. It has to be the steel. Call the vendor. That was the first thing Gregory Vance said, and he said it in March. He would go on saying versions of it, to different people, for 6 months. Because for 6 months the couplings came off the line looking perfect, and for 6 months they cracked, not all at once. That would have been mercy. They cracked slow, the way the truly expensive failures always do, long enough into testing that you'd started to hope, long enough that Vance had already sent the memo upstairs saying the program was on track. The couplings went into the thermal rig, and the rig cycled them hot and cold and hot again, hour after hour, day after day, and somewhere past the 8,000th cycle, on part after part after part, a hairline would open, always at the shoulder, always at the hard square corner where the fat part stepped down to the thin part. Always exactly where Walter Odom had told them, standing there with a full trash bin 6 months before. The Golden Boys were not stupid men. That's worth saying because it would be easy to make them fools, and they weren't. They ran the numbers. They ran them again. They pulled cracked parts off the rig and put them under a microscope and photographed the fracture and passed the photographs around the glass lab, and every photograph showed the same thing, a crack that started at the shoulder and walked inward, clean as a river finding the low ground. But they were looking at it the way Vance had taught them to look at everything, as a materials problem, a supplier problem, a tolerance problem, a problem you solved by changing what the part was made of, or how tightly you held the numbers, or who you bought your steel from, because those were problems that lived on a spreadsheet, and the Golden Boys lived on spreadsheets. Not one of them looked at the shape. The shape was so simple it was invisible to them. A square corner was just what a corner was. You draw a step, you draw it square, because that's how you draw a step. The idea that the geometry itself was the enemy, that the sharp corner was reaching out and grabbing all the stress and squeezing it into a single hairline until the metal gave, that was not a spreadsheet thought. That was a thought you had with a part in your hand at a bench at night, with grease under your nails. There was exactly one person in that lab who had that kind of night in her. Dana Reyes brought it up in May. She'd taken a cracked coupling home over a weekend, against the rules, technically, and sat with it at her kitchen table and turned it in the light, and she'd come in Monday morning and stood at the whiteboard and drawn the shoulder and drawn next to it a version with a curve. What if it's not the material, she said. What if it's the corner? If we put a fillet in, a radius right here, we spread the stress out instead of concentrating it at one line. It's a stress riser. We machined a stress riser into the part, and we've been blaming the steel. For a second, the second time in this story, a room went quiet at exactly the right idea. One or two of the Golden Boys tilted their heads at the whiteboard. Then Gregory Vance walked in from his glass office, looked at Dana's drawing, and said, "We are not retooling the entire line 6 weeks before delivery because of a doodle. The geometry is per spec. The spec was approved. If the part's failing, it's failing because somebody's steel is out of spec. And we are going to find out whose." He capped it with a smile. "Good instinct, Dana. Wrong problem. Chase the metallurgy." And Dana Reyes, 3 years out of Purdue, with a mortgage and a lab full of men who already thought she spent too much time on the floor, put the cap back on the marker and chased the metallurgy. The fix was in the room. It got erased off the whiteboard by lunch. Walter didn't know any of this, not the specifics. The R&D lab talked over him same as always, and nobody sends the janitor a copy of the failure report. But Walter knew the plant, and a plant tells you things if you're the man who moves through all of it at night and reads it like weather. He read it in the overtime, the machining floor running late on parts that kept coming back. He read it in the rejected parts cart, which had started living in the hall outside the lab, piled higher every week with couplings that looked perfect and weren't. He read it in Vance's office light, which used to go dark at 6 and now burned till 10, the man behind the glass with his tie loosened and his hand pressed to his forehead over a stack of paper. He read it in the way the day shift men had gone quiet in the lot at shift change. The way men go quiet when they've started to hear the word contract used in the past tense. And one night in late June, 11 years, almost to the week after page 104, Walter came around the corner of the R&D hall with his mop, and there was the rejected parts cart, and on top of it, dropped, discarded, was a single cracked coupling. He stopped, he set the mop against the wall, and he picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, cold in his hand, the machined surfaces still catching the sodium light. He turned it slow, the way he'd turned 10,000 parts before it, and he found the shoulder and he found the crack. There it was, a hairline, at the corner, walking inward clean, exactly the way he'd have drawn it walking if you'd asked him 11 years ago to draw how this part would die. Walter Odom stood alone in a dark hallway at 2 in the morning holding $4 million worth of failure in one scarred hand. And for a long moment he didn't move at all. Silence. He wasn't thinking about being right. Being right was old news. He'd been right since 1991. What moved through him standing there was bigger and slower than that. He was thinking about the machining floor and the men on it. He was thinking about the water tower. He was thinking about a plant full of families that were going to be handed to another state because 6 brilliant men and their $4 million boss would not round off a corner. He was thinking that he had the answer, that he'd had it the whole time, that it was sitting on a shelf in his garage, witnessed and dated, complete down to the heat treat and the feeds and speeds, a finished thing, an answer, in a world that had spent 6 months and a fortune looking for it and had called him simple to his face while it did. He set the coupling back on the cart exactly where it had been. He picked up his mop and he did not sleep that night. He was still awake at 4 at the bench, the 1991 notebook open under the bulb, the cold, cracked memory of that coupling still in his hand, though he'd left the part at the plant. He compared them anyway. In his mind, the drawing and the failure, and they were the same objects seen across 11 years, one of them the disease, one of them the cure, and only Walter Odom alive, holding both. He almost let it go. Understand that. He almost did the thing he'd done for 19 years, closed the book, kept the page, let the world be wrong because the world had earned it. There was a hard, tired part of him that said, they didn't want your help when you offered it. Let them drown. Keep it in the notebook, where it's safe, where it's yours. But then he thought about something he'd overheard 2 nights before, coming out of the lab. He'd heard one of the Golden Boys say the word patent. He'd heard them say that Vance had told legal to get an application ready to file on the new design the team was scrambling toward, whatever it ended up being, to lock it down before delivery, to protect it. A patent. On a coupling. On a shoulder they hadn't even fixed yet, but would, eventually by brute force and $4 million, stumble their way into rounding because they'd run out of everything else to blame. And when they did, they would file on it, and a brass plate would go on a machine, and a young engineer's name would go on the plate, and the idea would appear fully formed from the department that was paid to have ideas exactly the way a fixture had appeared with the name Prentice on it. 17 years and a whole lifetime. Walter looked at page 104 at the date, at Earl's name beside it, June 3rd, 1991. Something settled in him then, not anger, never anger, but a decision as level and quiet as a machinist's straight edge. He was not going to let them drown. That was the man Ruth had married. He wasn't going to become somebody else at 61. He was going to give the plant its coupling. But he was not going to hand it to a foreman and watch another man's name get bolted to it. Not this time. He got up from the stool. He crossed to the shelf, and for the first time in 19 years, Walter Odom took a notebook down, not to add a page, but to take one out. He lifted the 1991 volume off the shelf where it had sat since the year he wrote it, and he held it a moment, testing the weight of it, the weight of the thing he was about to do. Then he set it on the passenger seat of the truck, next to a thermos of black coffee he'd already filled without thinking, the way he used to fill 2 cups. He stood in the open garage door as the sky over the river went from black to the color of galvanized steel. Then he did something Walter Odom had never done in 19 years at that plant. He made an appointment with the United States Patent Office. Take a number and have a seat. If it's about a filing fee, the window on the left. If it's about a foreign application, you're in the wrong building. The woman behind the counter said it without looking up, and Walter understood that she'd said it 10,000 times, to 10,000 men who walked in believing they were about to become rich and famous, and walked out an hour later holding a rejection and a receipt. The patent office wasn't a courtroom. It was a gray office off a gray hallway with fluorescent tubes that hummed, a rack of pamphlets going soft at the edges, and a woman named Mrs. Ferris who'd been examining the hopeful for 22 years and had, somewhere in year 8, run entirely out of patience for hope. Walter had driven the 90 minutes to Columbus in a suit that no longer fit, a gray one bought for Ruth's funeral, taken in nowhere and let out nowhere since he'd sat in the truck in the lot for 10 minutes before he could make himself go in. He was 61 years old, and he'd never in his life asked an institution for anything. And every part of him that had spent 19 years staying invisible was telling him to put the notebook back on the seat and drive home. He went in. He took a number. When they called it, he sat down across from Mrs. Ferris, and he set the notebook on the desk between them, and he said the only sentence he'd rehearsed. I invented something a while back, and I think somebody's about to try and patent it, and I don't think it's theirs. Mrs. Ferris did not look up right away. She'd heard that sentence, or one just like it, more times than she could count. Everybody thinks that, she said, reaching for the notebook, the way you reach for a form you already know you're going to stamp denied. That's why they come here. Then she opened it. Walter watched her face, because her face was the only way he was going to know. She opened to a middle page. The way examiners do, testing whether the thing falls apart when you don't start at the beginning, and Walter saw the first small change. Her eyes went to the top right corner, page number, then to the top of the entry, a date, then down to the bottom of the page and stopped, a second name, a second date, read and understood, E. Kowalczyk. Mrs. Ferris turned a page. Another number, in sequence. Another date, later than the last. Another sketch, clean, complete. She turned back 3 years' worth in about 90 seconds, and the hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound in the room. And Walter watched a woman who had run out of patience for hope, slowly, page by page, run back into something she hadn't felt at that desk in a long time. These are contemporaneous, she said. It wasn't to him, it was to herself. Bound book, sequential pagination, dated entries, witnessed and dated by a third party. She looked up at him for the first time. Do you know what you have here? A notebook, Walter said. No. She set her hand flat on it, the way Earl had once set his hand flat on a scrap of cardboard, and something in Walter's chest turned over at that, though he didn't let it show. Mr. Odom, in this country right now, today, the patent doesn't go to whoever files first. It goes to whoever invented first if they can prove it, not claim it. Prove it. She tapped the page. Most people can't prove anything. They've got a napkin and a story. You've got a bound, dated, witnessed record going back years. She turned to the front of the book, to the year printed on the first page. How far back does this go? 1984, Walter said. That's the first one. There's 19 of them. That one's just the one I brought. Mrs. Ferris put her pen down. He showed her the page, then, page 104. The coupling in cross-section. The hard square shoulder crossed out, the smooth relief radius drawn in beside it, the size of it noted, the heat treat noted, the feeds and speeds to cut it noted, all in the block hand of a man who'd never had a drafting class and had taught himself to draw cleaner than men who had. and at the bottom, read and understood. E. Kowalczyk, 6391. June 3, 1991, Mrs. Ferris read aloud. She looked at the drawing a long moment. And you're telling me a company is about to file on this exact thing? The radius at the shoulder? I think they're going to, Walter said. They've been trying to make a part like that for 6 months. It keeps cracking. Right where I drew it not to. He said it flat. No heat in it. They don't know I exist. Far as they're concerned, I'm the fella empties their trash. Mrs. Ferris looked at him then, really looked. The way almost nobody had looked at Walter Odom in 19 years. The gray suit that didn't fit. The scarred hands folded on the edge of her desk. The whole quiet weight of the man. And something crossed her face that Walter couldn't quite read because he wasn't used to being read back. Here's what's going to happen, she said. And now she was all business, but a different business than the Denneed stamp kind. If they file, and you file, and it's the same invention, the office declares what's called an interference. A proceeding, both parties come in and prove their invention dates. The earliest inventor who was diligent about it, the earliest one who can document it, wins the priority, wins the patent. She slid a form across the desk. In every interference I have ever seen, the corporation walks in with a stack of internal reports dated last year, and the little guy walks in with a napkin. She tapped the notebook one more time. I have never once seen the little guy walk in with this. Walter looked at the form, at the line where his name would go. Bring the man, Mrs. Ferris said. Kowalczyk, if he's alive, bring him. A witness who can stand up and say, I read it, I signed it. That's the date, that's worth more than every one of their lawyers. She uncapped a pen and set it beside the form. And Mr. Odom, when you file, you don't need to describe the shoulder in fancy language. You've already got the best description of it that exists. She almost smiled. You wrote it in 1991. While Walter Odom sat in a gray office in Columbus with a pen hovering over a form 90 minutes east, in a glass-walled lab, Gregory Vance's legal counsel slid a crisp, laser-printed patent application across a mahogany desk and told him where to initial. The Golden Boys had finally 3 weeks before delivery, out of blame and desperation and nothing left to try, rounded off the shoulder, put a radius in it, and the couplings had stopped cracking, and nobody in that lab had said Dana Reyes's name, or remembered a doodle erased off a whiteboard in May, or thought for a single second about the man who emptied their trash. The idea had appeared, fully formed, from the department that was paid to have ideas. Vance initialed the application on every flagged page and told legal to file it that afternoon and get it locked down before the contract shipped. 2 men, 2 papers, the same drawn coupling on each. One of them dated 1991 and witnessed. One of them dated last week and initialed by a vice president. Neither man knew the other one had reached for the same page. Walter picked up the pen. Mrs. Ferris slid the form the last inch toward him and said the sentence he had waited 19 years to hear, without knowing he'd been waiting for it. Mr. Odom, based on these dates, you didn't copy them, they copied you. This is a formality. We'll be out by lunch. Gregory Vance said it to his lawyers in the elevator, straightening his silk tie in the brushed steel doors, and he believed it the way he believed most things, completely, and because it was convenient. He walked out by lunch, all right? He walked out understanding he'd lost before he sat down. The interference was held in a plain federal hearing room, wood panels going dull, a state flag, a long table split into 2 sides the way these things always are. On one side, Halloran, Vance, and beside him 2 attorneys in good suits, and a young associate with a rolling cart of banker's boxes, all of it dated, indexed, tabbed. The full weight of a $4 million company brought to bear. On the other side of that table, 1 old man in a gray suit that didn't fit, and beside him, 1 older man even bigger, in a sport coat that pulled tight across shoulders built by 40 years of welding. Vance glanced across at them the way you'd glance at a coat rack. A rival company, he assumed. Some competitor's inventor, some other outfit that had filed on a coupling. He leaned to his lawyer and murmured, "Who's their counsel?" "They don't have counsel," the lawyer said. "The gentleman's representing himself." Vance almost laughed. Then the examiner called the proceeding to order and asked the junior party, the party claiming the earlier invention date, to identify himself for the record, and the old man in the gray suit stood up. Walter Odom, and Gregory Vance's face did a thing it had never done in front of another person at Halloran Precision Works. It stopped. He knew the name the way you know a name you've said 100 times and never once attached to a full human being. And then the face caught up to it, the gray shirt, the trash bin, the parrot that said a whole sentence. And Vance sat there in a federal hearing room watching simple Walt raise his right hand and swear to tell the truth, and for a moment he genuinely could not make the pieces fit. The mop guy. The mop guy was the junior party. The mop guy was claiming he'd invented the coupling. Vance's lawyer leaned in, low. "You know him. He's a janitor." Vance whispered back, and there was the smile, reflexive, reaching for the old easy contempt. "He empties the trash. This is a joke. Whatever he's got, it's a napkin." The lawyer, who had done a great many of these and had learned to be afraid of quiet old men with self-representation, said nothing. The office laid it out plainly. Because that's how interferences go, not with speeches, but with dates. Halloran's evidence came first, and it was thorough. The R&D program logs, the failure reports, the design reviews, the final drawing with the radius on the shoulder, and the internal memo authorizing the fix. Boxes of it. Everything tabbed, and every single document, every one was dated within the last 14 months. The earliest scrap of paper Halloran could produce showing anyone there had conceived of rounding that shoulder was dated in May, this past May. Dan Arrayes's erased whiteboard, reconstructed after the fact, the doodle nobody had signed or dated at the time. May of this year. The examiner noted it. Turned to the junior party. "Mr. Odom, your earliest documented conception of the invention in dispute, the stress-relieving radius at the coupling shoulder." When? Walter reached down and lifted onto the table a black and white marbled notebook, soft covered, its spine cracked from use, and he opened it, without looking, without searching, to page 104, June 3rd, Walter said, 1991. The room went very still. "May I approach?" the examiner said, which examiners do not usually say, and crossed the floor herself to look at it, and stood over that page for a long time. The coupling in cross-section, the hard square shoulder crossed out. The smooth radius drawn in beside it, sized the heat treat, noted the feeds and speeds, noted. Page numbered in sequence, entry dated at the top in a careful block hand, and at the bottom in a second, heavier hand. Read and understood. E. Kowalczyk, 6391, 11 years and 1 month before Gregory Vance initialed his own application. The junior party may call his witness, the examiner said, and Earl Kowalczyk got up. He'd driven down from a little house near Springfield where he'd retired to a garden he didn't much like, and a recliner he liked too much. And he'd put on the one sport coat he owned, and he sat down in that chair like a man who had never once in 68 years been afraid of a room. He set his big hands flat on his knees. He looked at the notebook the way you look at an old friend's face. The examiner asked him if he recognized the signature at the bottom of page 104. "That's mine," Earl said. "That's my name and that's my hand. And the date? That's my hand too. June 3rd, 91. Earl nodded slow. "I know it's my hand because I only ever wrote it the one way, and I wrote it that way because Walt asked me to. He'd bring the book over to my bay on nights, and I'd read what he wrote, and if I understood it, if it made sense to me, I'd sign it and put the day. That was the deal. I didn't sign what I didn't read." He looked, for the first time, across the table at Vance and the lawyers in the tabbed boxes. "I read every page in that book, Mr. He is the smartest man I ever met in a plant, and I met a lot of 'em, and not one of you people ever once gave him the time of day." Halloran's lead attorney rose. He was good. You had to give him that. He didn't attack the notebook. You can't attack a date a witness will swear to. He attacked the only thing left. "Mr. Odom," he turned, smooth, reasonable, to Walter. "You're a custodian, a maintenance man. No engineering degree, no drafting training, no formal education in mechanical design at all." A pause. calibrated. It's a great deal to ask this office to believe that a janitor solved in a garage a problem that a professional engineering team could not, isn't it? It was the exact question the whole room had been circling. It was the question the last 19 years had been made of, and Walter Odom looked at the lawyer and answered it not with pride and not with anger, but the way he'd have answered a man who asked him how a lathe worked. "You want to know why the shoulder cracks?" Walter said. "It cracks because a square corner concentrates the stress into one line, same as you snap a chocolate bar along the scored edge, not the flat. Put a radius in and the stress spreads across the curve instead of piling into the corner. Bigger the radius, the better she holds, up to a point past that you're taking away too much material and you lose your seat. So you wanted about a 16th on that size coupling, and you want to draw the steel back after you harden it, or you trade a soft part for a brittle one and the brittle one cracks worse than the square corner ever did." He paused. "That's not a degree. That's just paying attention to a thing for 40 years. You can learn it either way. I only had the one way open to me. Nobody said anything." The lawyer looked down at his notes and did not ask a second question, because there wasn't one. The man had just described the invention from memory, more precisely than the $4 million report in the banker's box, and every person in that room had heard it. Gregory Vance sat very still, and the smile was long gone, and he was looking at the janitor the way you look at a wall of your own house that you suddenly realize has been load-bearing the entire time, holding the whole thing up while you leaned on it and never knew. The examiner returned to her table. She squared the notebook and Halloran's boxes side by side, the way you'd weigh two things in two hands, a marble dollar notebook dated 1991 and $4 million dated last year. Vance looked at the man he'd called simple for 19 years, and for the first time he didn't have a single thing to say. Neither did his lawyers. The examiner did. Priority of invention is awarded to the junior party. "Walter Odom," the examiner said, 11 words, and then she gathered her papers and left the room. And that was the whole of it. No gavel, no music. Just 11 flat words in a dull-paneled room, and a company's $4 million sliding, quietly and completely, into the hands of the man who emptied its trash. The letter came a few weeks later, on a Tuesday. It was one page from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and it had one name on it. It was not Halloran. They called Walter into the front office conference room to sign the paperwork, the good conference room, the one with the long table and the leather chairs and the framed photographs of Halloran men. Shaking hands with men in better suits. Walter had mopped that room 1,000 times on his knees under that same table, and he'd never once sat at it. He sat at it now. They'd put him at the head, which nobody had planned and everybody noticed. Down one side sat Halloran's counsel and a man from corporate whose face Walter didn't know. Across from them alone sat Gregory Vance. He had not worn the silk tie. That was the first thing Walter saw. A man who'd worn a silk tie onto a factory floor every day for years had come to this meeting with his collar open, and it made him look, for the first time, like what he actually was, a middle-aged man who had bet everything on the future and lost. The corporate man cleared his throat and laid it out, flat, because there was no other way to lay it out. The patent was Walter's. It had issued to Walter. And the coupling the defense contract required. The coupling already rolling off the line. The coupling that was this very week, keeping the water tower's fading letters attached to a town, was covered entirely by Walter's patent. Halloran could not legally build it, could not ship it, could not fulfill the contract that was holding the whole plant up without a license. "From Walter, we'd like to propose," the corporate man said, and slid a folder across the long table. "A licensing agreement, a royalty per unit for the life of the patent." There it was. The thing the audience of Walter's whole life had been waiting for without knowing it. The company wasn't just going to lose, the company was going to pay him. A few dollars on every coupling, every part. For as long as the patent lived, the plant that had called him simple for 19 years, cutting a check to Simple Walt on every single thing it made. And it was going to have to keep making them and keep paying him to survive. Gregory Vance's hand was resting on the edge of that folder. Walter watched it. He didn't mean to, but he watched it, and he saw the exact moment it happened. The hand went still. Not clenched, not shaking, just still. The way a machine goes still when the power drops out of it. The knuckles paled where they pressed the leather. Vance was looking down at the table, at his own hand, at nothing, and he swallowed once, dry, and Walter understood that the man was not going to shout, was not going to argue, was not going to do anything at all, because there was nothing left to do, and Gregory Vance had just run out of the one thing he'd never run out of before, which was the certainty that he was the smartest man in the room. Walter had waited 19 years to see that face. And here is the whole of the man, the thing that made him worth building a story around. Now that he had it, he took no pleasure in it. There was no triumph in Walter Odom's chest looking at Gregory Vance's stilled hand. There was something closer to the sorrow he'd felt on the river road months ago, because a man breaking is a man breaking, even a man who deserved it, and Walter had buried a wife and knew what it cost to watch anyone's world tilt, even from across a leather-topped table you used to clean on your knees. He picked up the pen. He read the agreement, all of it, slow, the way he read everything, while a room full of men in good suits waited on a janitor to finish reading. And then Walter Odom signed the licensing agreement in the same careful block hand that filled 19 notebooks in a garage, wrote his name the only way he'd ever written it, set the pen down. Gregory Vance finally looked up at him, not with contempt now, not with anything Walter had a name for, and the man opened his mouth. And it seemed for a moment like he might say the thing, the apology, the thank you, the 19 years worth of words that were owed, but he didn't have them. Men like Vance never do. What came out instead was small and dry and almost pleading. How did you? He stopped, tried again. You could have told us. Years ago. You could have just told us. Walter stood up. He buttoned the jacket of the gray suit that didn't fit, and he gave Gregory Vance the only answer the man was ever going to get, quiet, without a drop of cruelty in it, and truer than anything said in that room all day. I did tell you, Walter said. You said you didn't pay me to think. He let that sit 1 second. Then softer at the door, not turning around, you had $4 million. I had a pencil and a man who'd sign his name. Turns out that was enough, and he walked out. He didn't slam the door. He'd spent 19 years learning that the quietest men leave the loudest silence. And Walter Odom closed it behind him without a sound, since he never cashed the first one, not for 3 weeks. Just left it on the workbench, under the lamp, like he wanted to make sure it was real. That's what Earl told people, later when they asked. And it was true. For the next 12 years, every hydraulic coupling that left Halloran Precision Works paid Walter Odom a few dollars. Millions of parts. He never counted them. The checks came monthly, in plain envelopes, and he put most of them in the bank and thought about them hardly at all, because a man who'd built a whole life on knowing his own worth in an empty room did not suddenly need a check to tell him what he was. The contract shipped on time, the plant stayed open, the water tower kept its fading letters, and the men in the lot at shift change, the ones who'd handed him their coffee cups for 19 years without learning his name, kept their houses and never once knew that the quiet man with the mop was the reason. Gregory Vance was not destroyed. That's not how it works, and it's not what he deserved. He was reassigned. The $4 million department folded quietly into another. His name moved off the good floor and onto a smaller door. He wasn't ruined. He was left with something heavier than ruin. He was left knowing. Dana Reyes made chief engineer eventually. She was the one who insisted the patent plate on the line read Odom, the only brass plate in that plant that ever bore the right name. Walter kept sweeping for 3 more weeks, on his own terms. Then he gave his notice, in his block hand, 1 line. And the first thing he did with the money was drive out to a little house near Springfield and hand Earl Kowalczyk the keys to a new truck, because a man who signs his name for you at 2 in the morning for 11 years should not be riding around on bald tires. Earl cried. Walter didn't. Walter just kept the garage light on. Maybe you've known a man like Walter. The quiet one at the end of the bench. The one they talked over. The one who never argued because he didn't have to. If you've ever been the person nobody looked at twice and turned out to be the one who was right all along, tell me in the comments. Who was the quiet one in your life that everybody underestimated? I want to read every single story because the world is full of loud men with big budgets. But the truth has never once cared who was loudest. It only cares who was first. And Walter Odom, the man they called Simple, was first.